not too worried about finishing everything on the sheets. There's definitely stuff on there for you to follow up. But what I want to try and do is be more positive, which is not hard after what we've been through, isn't it? But think in terms of what we are seeking in how we use our power. So I'm assuming, and I haven't had time to go into this, but my assumption as I start is that power is a gift of God in creation, and that actually in and of itself it's a neutral thing like electricity. And electricity does amazingly great things and some tragically terrible things. And it's all to do with the purpose for which it's used. There was a beautiful illustration that in one book I read years ago, but it's really stuck with me, mainly because I'm a very amateur but aspiring musician. That if you were to imagine, say that actually the human race didn't get expelled after the first generation from Eden, and I know that it did, and I've read Genesis before, and I'm kind of aware of this. This is very hypothetical, but suppose that actually there were multi-generations in Eden living a sort of blissful existence, and suppose that there was a symphony orchestra assembled within Eden, and it had all the sort of different desks and instruments and tiers that a modern symphony orchestra would have, playing some glorious Mahler symphony or Shostakovich. By the way, that's Shostakovich on the front of my computer. That's not me. Some people think that I would actually have a sticker of my face on my computer. That is Shostakovich, okay? Just to clarify. He's one of my heroes, but anyway, I'll let part that. I'm glad if you were actually thinking that anyway. Then you assemble this orchestra. The question is, would it need a conductor? And the answer is yes, of course. But the conductor at their best, and history has shown that there have been dictatorial conductors. And in fact, there's quite a well-known British one who had to step back quite publicly just a year ago because he punched one of the tenors while they were on tour around Europe. But I've heard...
Tenors are annoying.
I've heard rumours about that conductor for years. I've got friends who are professional musicians in the classical world. Everybody knows about him. But it came out because suddenly it was public and he'd actually hit somebody. So yes, dictators are found on podiums. But a conductor at their best is there to marshal the forces of perhaps 100 plus people. And symphonic writing is truly astonishing. That there was a mind that could conceive of this and notate it on dots and lines, so that everybody could play, a wall of sound for 50 minutes. Sometimes some symphonies go over the hour. And talk about wall of sound. It's not Phil Spector. This is Mahler we're talking about. This is Wagner. This is incredible stuff. And basically, it is incredibly complex because the tempo might change every bar. It's not like Baroque stuff where basically you have the first violin that just sets the beat and you stick at it. No, without a conductor, it doesn't work. But what is happening at its very best is that the conductor knows everybody in the orchestra, is conducting in such a way that everybody is brought in to be part of this big thing. And each one is absolutely busting a gut to perform the best they can. And the best conductor will make every single person flourish in their music making so that the sum is far greater than the parts. That is conducting at its absolute best. And to my mind, that is the best metaphor for Christian power. Yes, it's needed, and when it works, it's wonderful. And everybody flourishes. It's the exact opposite of what you fear. And I think there are two areas that we can think about this, and they are truth and freedom. There are other angles I could take, and other books on the reading list do take, but I just want to drill down a little bit in these two areas. So let's think about truth and truth-telling. Quite timely after the verdict in New York yesterday, even though, from what I gather, there are all kinds of problems with that. But anyway, as a culture, for reasons we talked about, I think we are more attuned than ever to dark agendas. And we perceive them around every corner. And that is verging on the paranoia. That is exactly what paranoia is. But it's not paranoia if they really are out to get you. Or are they? But they are. Or are they? And you just get swallowed up in this sort of vortex of suspicion. And, you know, I'm not just talking about interviewing politicians. The prevailing assumption is that everybody hides things. I hide things. There's plenty of stuff I don't want you to know. And you know, Jeremy Paxman had a famous line about interviewing journalists that I can't repeat because it's a little rude for these very august surroundings. But basically the assumption is in journalism, certainly investigative, but now pretty much any area of journalism, is that they're lying. My job is to get out the truth. But for Christians, this is unconscionable, or should be. Let your yes be yes, your no, no. And yet, when these power abuses happen in Christian circles, the yeses are not yeses. So convictions, I would say, about the truth of Christ should automatically inspire commitments to be truthful like Christ. Let me say that again. Convictions about the truth of Christ ought automatically to inspire commitments to be truthful like Christ. And you'd think that was axiomatic, that was basic. But it isn't. Now think about it. What is a lie? This has been very painful for me to dig into this stuff. Because, you know, you look in the mirror and think, oh, yeah, I have done that. Well, a lie is the rejection of true truth, of reality. That's for starters. But it is also an attempt to mold reality to my personal ends, however small it is. So that something that isn't true is told because it suits me in some way, or suits what I want to do, or suits my self-protection, perhaps. Ultimately, it's gaining some degree of control over another person, because they are now maybe denying their perception of reality, or they just don't know about an area of reality, but they are conforming to my perception of reality. Does that make sense? So I'm trying to basically corral them into the way I think. So actually, you know, Francis Schaeffer used to talk about true truth and reality. And if this is fundamentally a denial of reality, it's a big thing, which is why a lie actually is so serious. This is what Joseph Goebbels said. We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect. Now think about that. We're not communicating a fact, an idea, a reality. We are wanting an effect. We want them to be changed in some shape or form, to somehow be molded to this other way of thinking, our way of thinking. And so basically what's going on, and the Nazis, Goebbels particularly, were geniuses at this, but so were the Stalinists. Achieving power through the illusion of truth. Now, you can, yes, that's lying, But when you put it in those terms, suddenly it becomes a much bigger deal, doesn't it? The illusion of truth. Someone that I found incredibly helpful on this was this guy, Joseph Pieper. He was a Catholic layman, a philosopher, and his life pretty much spanned the 20th century. And he was born just the year after Goebbels in Germany. And so he was someone who had witnessed this precise phenomenon, and he wrote as a short book. I think I read it in maybe a day. It's pithy and very, very clear. It's called Abuse of Language, Abuse of Power. I was just blown away by it. Let me give you one or two little highlights from it. And these are on the sheets as well that you've used your QR code successfully to achieve. But anyway, these are some quotes from this little book. If I'm encountering a neighbour, so that's a sort of, I'm meeting somebody, and it doesn't matter who they are, but in biblical terms, everybody is my neighbour. All right, so I'm encountering my neighbour. How can I treat them like this? So, whoever speaks to another person, not simply, we presume, in spontaneous conversation, but using well-considered words, and whoever in doing so is explicitly not committed to the truth. In other words, my starting point as the subject of the conversation is I'm not talking about the truth, I'm just wanting to assert something, my reality, my perception, whatever it is. If that is the case, whoever, in other words, is in this guided by something other than the truth, such a person, as in me, the speaker, from that moment on, no longer considers the other as a partner, as an equal. They are not at the same level as me. In fact, he no longer respects the other as a human person. Because if you did, you wouldn't do this. From that moment on, to be precise, all conversation ceases. All dialogue and all communication comes to an end. But then, what's taking place? Well, what is then taking place? But let's just pause there. Do you see? He's saying basically the moment I am not engaging in truth as a perception of the reality that you and I share as fellow creatures made in the image of God, human beings, the moment I'm asserting something that I know isn't true, that I want you to conform to, I am not treating you as my equal. I am treating you as my object. Okay? Everyone happy so far? Okay, so what actually is going on if I'm doing this, if I'm lying? Well, I'm not considering the other as equal. I'm considering the other as, at best, useful. At worst, something worse. He continues. Rather, he has become for me an object to be manipulated, possibly to be dominated, to be handled and controlled. Thus, the situation is just the opposite of what it appears to be. It appears, especially to the one so flattered, as if special respect would be paid, while in fact this is precisely not the case. His dignity is ignored. I concentrate on his weaknesses and on those areas that may appeal to him in order to manipulate him, to use him for my purposes, an instrument of power. All right, so the other person does not have the same dignity, reality, rights as I do in how I treat them. Okay? Finally, this lesson in a nutshell. The abuse of political power is fundamentally connected with the sophistic abuse of the words or language in general. So, indeed, it finds in it the fertile soil in which to hide and grow and get ready, so much so that the latent potential of the totalitarian poison, he's a German philosopher, a totalitarian poison can be ascertained, as it were, by observing the symptom of the public abuse of language. Now, let me unpack that. He lived through Nazi Germany and came out the other side, and as a philosopher, he could see and analyse at a particularly deep level what had happened. And it's fascinating that language was absolutely central to what happened. Now, one of my favourite essays ever written, it's an essay that everybody, I think, should read every couple of years. It's George Orwell's essay, Politics and the English Language. It's about 10 pages or less. You can get it on internet. You can download the PDF of it, but it's also been in lots of anthologies of his. It is just stunning. And he wrote it in the 30s, so before the Second World War, in about 36, 37, I think. And he had witnessed terrible things in the Spanish Civil War, so he'd been in Barcelona, and that shaped a lot of his political thinking thereafter. He was left-wing, but he could see what went wrong even with that, so that explains Animal Farm in 1984 and other things. In this essay, basically, one of the most insightful, brilliant points is he just says, just look how they use idioms and metaphors, and how these just slip off the tongue, basically not as a means of communicating clearly, but as a means of obscuring things. And basically, once you read this essay, you will see it, and it describes today. It describes the nice, sort of mealy-mouthed, but impressive-sounding language that people find to describe, I don't know, the Rwanda scheme, or national service, or Labour keeping the tax rates the same as Tories had it, trying to be non-partisan there. You name it, everybody does it. Languages are used not to communicate, but to obscure. And what is true in politics is true now of every sphere of human interaction. And it is true in the church. And it is arguable that in some ways, Paul's letters are provoked by some of this stuff. I mean, he would never put it like this, or in Orwell's terms, but you know, some of the ways people are behaving, say in Corinth, or Diotrephes, and Alexander the metalworker, and some of these characters, actually there's some pretty dark stuff going on when you start digging deep as to what actually was the problem. You know, what's the big deal with saying the resurrection has already happened? Yeah, there are theological issues, there's eschatology there, but there's other stuff going on about language and truth. So here are one or two questions that we might throw out for our church life. Are we committed to truths about Christ and truthfulness like Christ? Is truthfulness a value in our community? Just the act of being truthful, even when it's awkward or embarrassing? Or are there things that actually everybody knows about but can't talk about? Oh, we can't talk about that. That's just too close to the bone. Are we quick to justify lies or half lies or white lies, a little economy with the truth? Perhaps to massage a reputation or protect somebody else's? I mean, life is complicated. We don't live in a vacuum, and I've been in very difficult situations where actually you kind of think, okay, if I say this, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we can go through all the permutations. But I'm just asking the question, how much value do we put on this? Or to protect the good name of the organisation, to protect the work. That was one I was brought up with after I was converted. We've got to protect the work. Or to convince joining potential members that joining our lot is better than joining their lot. But it can be more subtle even than that. Perhaps there's a genuine debate in the wider church, and we're terrified that our people might head down that blind alley that we've seen people lose their faith over. I mean, let's be realistic. People lose their faith, and sometimes they lose their faith because they start getting involved in some questions, or they get distracted by this activity or whatever. It happens. And if you're a pastor, you long for people to keep walking the walk. And it's easy, isn't it? How quickly we just start finding some convenient labels that just are the amber, if not red lights. Oh, that's a classic liberal argument. Yeah, we don't need to give it time. Or, Fred has started saying X, which is quite troubling because it obviously means that he's no longer committed to scriptural authority. Doesn't believe the Bible anymore. Well, that's a sweeping statement, but I've heard that a lot. She's gone all social gospel, and it's just completely derailed her. And we don't want to be social gospel. We've got to keep holding to the truth, especially, in this day and age. Nobody wants to be an enemy of the cross, do they? How easy it is to wheel out these labels that actually contain all kinds of assumptions and issues that we don't have time to go into now. And let's face it, many of these issues are legit. They are concerns in every direction, either going funny or liberal or whatever. Yes. But they actually become words or weapons to try and ward people off certain things. And therefore, they're not actually tools of truth communication, but corralling and manipulating. It's so easy. I've done it a gazillion times. And I think one of the most significant things that I've realized is that the power that a Christian leader has is basically invisible. There are the sort of visible elements that come from an office or a title or a position. And that, if you're the pastor or you are the chair of the PCC or whatever it is, yes, those are concrete, but actually sometimes you can see in a community the most powerful person is the one with no titles at all and no official responsibility. But dig around a little bit, they're the ones who call the shots, right? Because usually they've got the money. And it's amazing how often the money guy is in charge, even though nobody even knows their name. I remember preaching once in All Souls, if you know, central London, seats about 1,000, just under. I remember it was one of those moments I nearly sort of collapsed in a heap in the middle of a sermon, which would have been embarrassing and awkward, and thankfully I didn't. But it was just such an obvious thing at one level, but I was blaring on about something important probably. And it just suddenly knocked me between my eyeballs. Here are 1,000 people doing what nobody in modern British society would ever do in a million years. They're sitting there for about a half hour, in my case usually a couple of hours, in silence, some taking notes, sitting on the edge of their seats, holding to every single word, and not only that, they would do what I told them to do. I mean, there is no other context in modern society that would happen, I don't think. Perhaps in a mosque, I don't know. Politicians don't get that. They heckle from the moment they start. The closest you would get that kind of attention, I imagine, is the stand-up comedian. I can't think of other, maybe have a think and tell me where I'm wrong, but not in the sense of being willing and ready, hungry even, to do what they're told. And I was suddenly terrified. But it's not that we can just shrug our shoulders and say, well, I'm not like that. I had that. It was in my hands. I was standing there. I had half a talk still to go. And it's actually, at its best, the conductor bringing out each individual to flourish in a way only they know and only can do. And an orchestra at the top of its game is like nothing I've ever experienced. It's amazing. It's, 100 people all going nuts. And you're just it's incredible. It's like nothing else. That's what we long for. That's why I still believe in this stuff, even though we can really clearly see where it's gone wrong. But I think a fundamental thing to own, to absolutely take hold of is truth-telling. And truth-telling starts with the small things. And then the more you do it with the small things, it's never going to be easy, but the more familiar you are with the big things. So that's one. The second is freedom. And the person who really helped me on this was Bonhoeffer, and his little book, Life Together. And that's a book to read every 5 years, if not more. It's only 100 pages. It's very dense. He goes a bit bonkers about Lutheran hymns at one point, but hey, he's a German Lutheran, so what can you do? But basically, it grew out of that extraordinary little period, about 3 or 4 years, when he and a small group of young trainee ministers in the confessing church, which was basically pretty much illegal. So the state Lutheran Church had gone full Nazified, and there are extraordinary photographs of some of these church buildings that have replaced the cross on the table with swastikas and all this sort of stuff. The German church, it called itself. And there was a courageous but tiny group who said, no, that is an absolute rejection of the gospel. And so in this little town on what is now in Poland, on the north coast at Finkenwalde, they lived together in a community, probably no more than 20, I think, at any one time. And then it got shut down by the Gestapo after about 4 years. And basically he writes this book largely out of the experiences of trying to do life together, hence the title Leave. And it's incredibly perceptive and powerful. And there are bits of it where I sort of wept with relief that somebody was saying something that I felt but couldn't quite articulate, and I didn't quite know what was going on. And in those sort of situations, you're desperate for somebody who's been there before you to say, this is what's going on. And he nails it again and again in such a brilliant way. But there's this glorious section where he's talking about confessing your sins. And he's saying, look, we're not talking about the Catholic confessional box. But he's picking up on James talking about confess your sins to one another. And again, he's not saying everybody should hang out all their dirty washing for everybody to see, so we're all in the same boat. Hi there. But it's basically everybody needs to have one or two people who know us and that we can confess our sins to, and know they won't reject us. And he has this extraordinary illustration, or sort of sequence where he talks about the shock and horror in a church community when they suddenly discover that there is a sinner in the midst. And the shock, this is appalling, who let them in? This is terrible, get them out of here, this is the church. And of course, it's satirical, and yet it's actually journalistic. Because how shocked we are in our little communities when suddenly somebody does something terrible. And we all know about it. And man, do we condemn them and exile them. And you see, the reason people will not confess their sins to one another is because of that. They'll be cast out. One strike and you're out. That is our churches. I'll never forget a story I heard about an Irish Protestant minister. It might have sort of got garbled and expanded like stories do over the years, but it went something like this. So there was a senior guy who often had young assistants come and spend 2 or 3 years to train in their first church experience of ministry. and then they go off somewhere else. You know, the classic sort of cycle of having apprentices or assistants. And so the senior pastor has got a new guy that he's just sort of easing into the role. One summer he's just joined, just moved in. And as my first boss, Hugh Palmer, did with me in my first month after ordination, basically I accompanied him on lots of his different visits. I did, you know, some funerals with him, some weddings and hospital visits, just to see how he did it. And I learned a lot from it. I'm very glad he gave me that time. So that's what's going on. The senior guy is taking this young man with him, and they're going to visit somebody in the congregation who lives in the town. And basically this guy they're going to visit, his life has just collapsed. I mean, a catastrophe. Basically, he ran his own business that was doing quite successfully, but basically things had come out that there was some dodgy dealing. The police are now investigating. He's been suspended from his role and he's not allowed in the building and stuff. And his wife had no idea, and she's been struggling anyway, and this is the final straw. So she's left him and taken the children with her, and it's just awful. So everything seems to be collapsing, and now the guy is hitting the bottle, and he's just mortified, he's terrified, he's ashamed, just you name it, it's gone wrong, and he's never leaving the house, never opens the curtains, he's there on his own at home. He's a mess. But he's been a stalwart member of the church, so the humiliation was just intolerable. Senior guy takes the young guy, and they're walking down the hill to this guy's house, and he just says, let's call the business guy, let's call him Fred. Could you ever see yourself in Fred's position? The junior guy says, well, boy, I wouldn't wish what he's going through on my worst enemy. It's just awful. Just terrible. I can't imagine what he must be thinking. He's been left. I understand why he's hit the bottle. I mean, who wouldn't? You just want to blank it all out, and maybe he's going to go to jail. I mean, it's awful, isn't it? Yes, but could you see yourself in that position? He said, well, it's awful. I really want to love the guy and support him. I'm really glad we're going there. But to be honest, I don't run a business, and I don't think, well, frankly, no, I don't think so. To which the senior guy said, right, okay. In that case, I think you better go home and I'll go on alone. Because the last thing that guy needs is somebody who thinks he's better than him. And I know full well that, but for the grace of God, that is not a slogan. That is absolutely true. There is nothing I know myself I could not justify doing. Nothing. It was a very difficult lesson to learn that. Because I thought I was quite respectable. I've got privilege. I've had good education. I know how the world works. I can navigate. I can operate it. Yeah, no, I've got standards. There is nothing I couldn't justify. This is a terrifying thought. But I've never forgotten that senior pastor, and that has become a kind of plumb line for my ministry in the last 20, 30 years since hearing that. I know that any situation that somebody finds themselves in, it could be me, obviously with permutations, but in principle. So then the question is, what does it mean to be free in the Christian life? What does freedom look like? So let me read a couple of sort of extracts from Life Together. God, and he's talking about other people, and initially it's in the community of Finkenwalder, but it corresponds, and that's what's so brilliant about this book. It applies far beyond their little sort of weird commune that they had illegally. He says this: God did not make others as I would have made them. God did not give them to me so that I could dominate and control them, but so that I might find the Creator by means of them. Now other people, in the freedom which they have been created, become an occasion for me to rejoice. whereas before they were only a nuisance and trouble for me. God does not want me to mould others into the image that seems good to me, that is, into my own image. Instead, in their freedom from me, God made other people in God's own image. Do you see that? Part of their freedom is they don't have to be like me. That is integral to their freedom. I can never know in advance how God's image should appear in others. That image always takes on a completely new and unique form whose origin is found solely in God's free and sovereign act of creation. To me, that form may seem strange, even ungodly. But God creates every person in the image of God's Son, the crucified. And this image likewise certainly looks strange and ungodly to me before I grasped it. Now, he's on some thin ice there, but you get the point. And for that person to flourish as made in the image of God, it's highly likely, if not inevitable, it's going to look very different from the way I flourish. He then picks us up just a few pages later. First of all, it is the freedom of the other. And that is a burden to Christians, he says. Uh-huh. Why is other people's freedom my burden? The freedom of the other goes against Christians' high opinion of themselves, and yet they must recognize it. Christians could rid themselves of this burden if they didn't release the other person, but did violence to him, stamping him with their own image. But when Christians allow God to create God's own image in others, they allow others by their own freedom. Allow others their own freedom. Thereby, Christians themselves bear the burden of the freedom enjoyed by these other creatures of God. All that we mean by human nature, individuality, and talent is part of the other person's freedom, as are the other's weaknesses and peculiarities that so sorely try our patience, and everything that produces the plethora of clashes, differences, and arguments between me and the other. Here, bearing the burden of the other means tolerating the reality of the other's creation by God, affirming it, and in bearing with it, breaking through to delight in it. Now, at this point, he's not talking about our sinfulness. He will talk about that. He's not denying that. So it's not like, you sometimes hear today, I am made in God's image, come what may, so therefore whatever I do and whatever I desire is right. No, we are sinful. But we are different because God made us different. And that is their freedom. Now, I think there are many ways in which it is this fundamental thing that has been misunderstood or ignored that have led to some of the most horrible abuses in recent years. I think there are sort of three ways that you can see this played out in churches. So, a community's vision, or the influence they're seeking, the legacy they're driving for. And this kind of thing can overtly or subtly affect an elders meeting, or it's a way of, are you with us or against us? She hasn't quite got the vision. Or he's always asking different questions. I just wish he'd just, get on with us. Let's do the awkward squad, and I've been in ministry for years. You can see the awkward squad coming towards you at 100 paces, can't you? Okay, here we go. Life would be so much easier without them. Whose vision actually is it? Who set it? Who's agreed to it? Has it changed? Has anybody had a voice in tweaking it, in discussing it? Or actually, is it just one or two or three leaders alone in their sort of cabal in a broom cupboard somewhere, and then suddenly, this is where God is leading us? Is that freedom? Or what about how preaching and teaching and training up of others happens? The equipping and stretching and, deep end stuff, giving people the experience of ministry that is necessary. Sometimes you can't learn things in a textbook. You actually have to do it. So, I've been involved with Langham for 20 plus years. It's about preaching primarily our bit. And, in some ways, some of the things we do are very similar to what happens in a homiletics class in a seminary. But I can tell you that actually very often that class, while it's a necessary element of people's training, actually doesn't really make any difference to them. It's only after 2 or 3, 5 years in the job, you see the whites of the eyes from the pulpit and you suddenly realize, whoa, I'm not connecting it. What have I done wrong? It's only once you're doing it that you realize actually you're missing it or you need more or whatever. And that's where the learning happens. And there are lots of things like that. You can't learn how to drive from a book. Can you imagine if that's what happened? I wouldn't drive. Anyway. Or are these areas of training, particularly training others and training younger people, the next generation, are they actually merely platforms for dominance and control and self-replication? You want to recruit and train up your successor. I kind of get that, but I'm also very uncomfortable about that. And there are reasons why very often, certainly in my context in the Anglican Church, the incumbent, the leader, is not allowed to do that. Now, like all these things, church polity and the rules and niceties of how churches are governed, there really isn't a perfect one. I'm definitely not somebody who just bangs a drum for one particular polity, because all of them have their weaknesses in all of this stuff. I'm absolutely convinced. None of them is perfect. And actually, one that we really like in one context could be a disaster in another. So I don't think one can even be sort of blanket about it. But it's amazing that actually the very worst thing you could possibly do is assume it's your job to find your successor. Now, where I think there is an element is we want to train up the next generation for wherever God's sake takes them. We need to invest in that. A lot of people don't do that. That's great. But it's not my job to determine who's going to take over, because actually, who knows what the church is going to need in 10 years' time in a way that I can't even imagine it. And maybe God needs that place to have someone very different from me. Or not. Maybe. Who knows? And then the whole area of people management and line management and, HR, all this sort of stuff. There's a lot of talk about HR. I actually detest the term human resources, because humans are not resources. Humans are humans. So you can't really call them humans, because that's a bit odd. I don't know what you call it. Pretty much any management speak term I'm going to hate on principle. Okay, HR, so we don't have to think about what it stands for, fine. We need these systems. I do believe that they are important, and having protocols and policies, we need them, especially as organizations are complex and get bigger or whatever. I'm not dissing that at all, but isn't it amazing how even in situations where there is a very sophisticated system that should prevent these abuses, is circumvented or exploited for whatever means. And I've seen this in Anglican churches, I've seen it in free churches, I've seen it in Catholic churches, where basically each system has in place things that should prevent this from happening. And it's impossible, because people are very, very clever. The heart is deceitful above all things. We're very good at sort of working our way around the system. So the issue is there freedom in those I manage or lead or disciple or mentor? And I think certainly in the networks I came from, so I was involved in a script union camp that met in the summer for several years. It was the UN camps for private school kids. And there were many things about it that I'm very grateful to God. I was converted just after I was 18. I didn't know anything. and I learned a huge amount. In the years, weirdly, that I was teaching in this seminary in Uganda, actually, I ended up as acting principal at the age of 31, which is just bonkers. But I learned how to run our faculty meetings from the leaders' room at camp. I mean, I wasn't as brutal as that was, but I learned some of that stuff. So, praise God. But there were definitely shadow sides and dark sides, and I think this was one of them. Basically, the assumption that if I am mentoring somebody, usually younger, usually a lot younger, I am responsible for their spiritual well-being and their sanctification. And as soon as you've made that leap, you can go anywhere. And it did happen. That's why some individuals who were on the extreme end, this is why it hit headlines and was so scandalous, is because actually they would then indulge in ghastly things, beatings, naked beatings, as a way of helping them defeat their sin. That's not my job. But the leader was imposing his means and methodology on the one led. And it destroyed some people. They are shells of what they were because of this. Some were a bit more robust and came through better, and that's great. That was a mercy, though. Basically, the assumption being that it's my job to make you holy. But there's only one person with that job, and that's the Holy Spirit. And actually, it is far better for me to advise and for you to make a stupid decision your own way, even though I'm sitting there and thinking, I know where this is going to lead, but I've said what I could. It's much better for them to do the stupid thing their own way than to do the right thing your way. But that seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? But then what you've got to do, and this also failed to happen, then what you've got to do is, when they've done the stupid thing, you are still their friend. And there's no I told you so about it. Your door is still open. Whereas actually what would happen, if people disobeyed their leader, they would be given the cold shoulder. They'd be sent to Coventry. There would be emotional abuse to make them feel the error of their ways, so that that would never happen again. Pure manipulation. I saw that happening. Again, because the person has assumed that it's their job to make them holy. And it's such a good desire, isn't it? We want people to grow. We want the best for them. We want them to flourish. In fact, all of this, I'm using my power for their flourishing. But they're not free. We are freed from our sin, not for anybody else but God. That's the story of Exodus, isn't it? Freed from Egypt for the worship of Yahweh. That's the trajectory. The Enlightenment gets that wrong because they think freedom is just about what you're free from, so you can do anything you like. But the Bible's idea of freedom is the service of God, which is perfect freedom. Very quickly, just a few things as I finish. Walter Brueggemann is an extraordinary writer, and I really admire his thinking. I don't see eye to eye with him on a lot of stuff. He probably say, he certainly would say the same of me. Who do I think I am? But anyway, he's a remarkable Old Testament scholar. This is him talking about the Imago Dei in Genesis 1. And particularly Genesis 1 and 2, just noting how God operates in creation and in delegation in creation to the man and woman. And he says what you see there in the picture of God and the picture of humanity first made is the creative use of power which invites, evokes, and permits. There is nothing here of coercive or tyrannical power, either in God or for mankind. Nothing. And Brueggemann calls Genesis 1 a revolutionary text for all kinds of reasons. So what I tried to do is summarize what you've got here is a spectrum of how power operates. I've been sort of playing around with this for a while. It's not perfect, but hopefully it begins to get something of the idea. If you can think of ways of improving or tweaking it, I'd love to hear, because it's a sort of work in progress. But if you take the spectrum as having sort of slavery at one end and flourishing at the other, and various increments along the way, and you could break that up how you wanted. But let's say, for the sake of this, just to keep it simplified, you have enslavement and then you have constraint, which is not as bad as that, but it's on the spectrum, on the trajectory. In the middle, you have just existing, being, which is neither one thing nor the other, and that's okay. A lot of us spend a lot of time doing that, especially when you're hoovering or something. You just exist and think other things. Then actually there's on the positive end, there's growth and then real flourishing. You're firing all cylinders, but actually there's a sense in which this is what I'm about. This is what I'm meant to be doing. I'm playing my clarinet to the best of my ability, and everybody else is going crazy, and Mahler's great, and so on. That's the idea. I quite like Mahler. Anyway. And so basically what you've got is, think about it in terms of the image of God. Whose image is in focus? Now, the further down the negative end, the slavery end, the image actually is not God's, but the master. And you are being conformed by force to the image of the master, and woe betide you if you deviate. And that includes doing things in a certain way that satisfies them, or whatever it is. So you obey. If they tell you that this is bad for your godliness, I don't know, let's take something silly, eating cream teas on a Thursday. If that's bad for your godliness, and then you do it, you're in trouble. Right? Because the master does not eat cream teas on a Thursday. That's, sacrosanct. And basically what they are wanting is self-replication, with lots of mini-me's around who make them feel more affirmed that they've got a legacy that people will notice. So, oh, I see where he's come from, where she's come from. Oh, yes, you're part of that group, and I can really see the hallmarks, which is not exactly as positive as it might sound. But at the other end, actually, and this is Bonhoeffer's point, they have been freed to flourish in the way that God has made them in the image of God. So they are equal in the image, as I am, to one another. We are all on a level playing field. But the amazing thing about the Imago Dei is that it's manifests in such different ways. Here we are in this room, case in point. Lots of funny faces in here. And the way you flourish could be, and almost certainly is, very different from the way I do. You probably detest Mahler. I mean, you're all Pt.3 fans, I can tell. But if I am growing and mentoring somebody and freeing them to be who God wants them to be, I am serving them and letting them fly. And that's got to be the dream. But hang on a minute. The New Testament is quite clear. You cannot do this without the gospel. Because if you try and do this without the gospel, what do you get? Well, you get the twin demons of legalism and license. And Galatians is brilliant at unpacking that. So basically, legalism is a form of slavery, usually defined by the leader who says what's in and what's out. License is equally defined from the top, but it's saying, well, look, it doesn't really matter how you behave, it doesn't matter how you live, you're free. Go for it, do whatever you like. You're forgiven anyway, kind of thing. But both of those, as Galatians, the second half of Galatians is so good at clarifying, both of those are grotesque errors that ignore grace. And so at the center of everything, and I've cut a long story very short, at the center of everything is the need to keep the gospel of grace clear. And what I mean by that, I think you could sum up as Jesus washing your feet. That is the bottom line. That's the beginning and the end of this. And thinking, what would Jesus do? Cliche. But fundamental. And you look at some of these horrors from recent years, and I've been sort of adjacent to several and talked to people at length. Many hours, many tears, many furies, trying to figure out what on earth happened. The thing that was completely absent was grace. We're going to have some time for Q&A. I just put here just things to ask and think about as a sort of diagnostic thing. I don't want to go into depth. I'll just flag them off and then we can. Are we going to Q&A straight away? Or
we can do a kind of 5-minute grab of tea and come sit back down again. Bring the tea.
Yes, please. These are sort of questions to ask about your community, and these are things worth asking when things are going well as well. This is not saying that, these are just healthy checks. Like when you're 50, you get all kinds of funny things happen to you in the NHS. But I think we should keep asking this. So the first is, I put local there deliberately. It's who are the local weak and strong in your neighborhood, or if you're a parish church, people who live adjacent to you. Does your church reflect some of those demographics and differences? Or do you find you're only drawing from one group? Now, people want to have sort of multicultural churches, and that's great, and I've been in some, and there's something profoundly amazing and joyous about it. But you're not going to be a multicultural church if the immediate area you're living in is not very multicultural. You're going to reflect your area, but actually the question nearly always is, do you actually reflect your area? Or is it just a sort of slice of it? And then if you do have people reflecting the different groups in your area, do they function in the same way in the church family fellowship as they do out there? So, one church I was sort of adjacent to in London, it was quite a Hispanic area. Quite a lot of people from South and Central America were in that little area, and it's amazing. London is extraordinary, isn't it? How you find these pockets of places, a whole 30,000 people all speaking Bosnian in one area or whatever. Amazing. And that's one of the things I love about London. You turn a corner and you're in a different part of the world somehow. But in this particular area, the Hispanics, they were all office cleaners, doing shift work, night work, that kind of thing. And in this particular church, they had one or two Hispanics who started coming along, and they were loved, they were welcome, so that, they enjoyed being part of the church. But isn't it interesting, in that particular church, the caretaker who cleaned the loos was Hispanic, and therefore reflecting exactly the same social, I want to say status or role as they did outside. Whereas wouldn't it be amazing if the same person who was an office cleaner, actually, when you get to know him, you suddenly realise, actually, there's a real integrity in leadership here. Why don't we put them on the PCC? So, yeah, he's cleaning loos on Monday, but in the church council, he's a really important voice. Are we different, in other words? Or are we just a carbon copy of where we are? And you see, the thing is, if you look at the history of the Christian church, say in the Roman Empire, it was precisely the fact that people who were, in quotes, slaves might be found in a congregation preaching, and people who were, quote, patrons might be there sitting at their feet and learning about Jesus from them. That kind of is what's going on in Paul's ministry, even in the New Testament. There's a strong argument to suggest, some people say that they all would, I don't think so, but there's a strong argument to suggest Luke was an ex-slave, because nearly all medics in the Roman Empire were. Because no self-respecting sort of middle class or up-and-coming person would ever do something as foul as do medicine. Because that's, we don't do body stuff, we do mind and spirit stuff. So no Roman would ever touch that sort of bodily fluid. I mean, it's kind of how I feel as well. But anyway, that's and to train as a medic was expensive. So no poor person is going to do that. So basically, it was slaves who were sent off by their master if they were intelligent, to Greece or wherever to learn how to be a medic, and then they'd come back and they'd be a nicer learner than the boss. So if Luke was a doctor, as we think, and he was part of this whole thing, it's highly likely he was a freedman, which actually fits with how Luke writes his gospel. I think there are some elements. He's very conscious of the outsiders and the marginal in his gospel and in Acts. So it all fits. I could be completely wrong. Who cares? But you see the point. So do we just reflect where we're at, or are we different? And does that make people sit up and say, "Oh, didn't expect that"? How are questioners and doubters treated? I remember one of my students in Uganda was in a church where he asked a question, he was told never to do that again. I said, leave that church. And he did. And everything I know about that particular church ever since, this was 25 years ago, has made my blood curdle. Are they free to fail? Is your church a safe place to be a sinner? Do you help people to sin well? If not, why not? You saying you don't? And, well, that last point has a word that I detest. And it's not ministry. 4 years teaching in Kampala completely inoculated me against strategies. I know what you're thinking, and I know.
We're agreeing, Mark.
But I hate them. And you have your strategy, that's great, and then just be completely prepared to do nothing of the sort. And say, praise God, amen, hallelujah, goodbye.